Hello, everyone. My name is Fiona Schönberg. I'm a novelist and currently independent researcher and narrative designer from Germany. And I will be speaking about the narrative potential of the formal elements of narrative single-player games, especially as it pertains to the mediation of systemic oppression. Even leaving aside the extremely dubious labor conditions across much of the industry, forms of oppression are a common sight across the diegetic worlds of many a video game. These forms of oppression and marginalization range from the accidental, like the queer phobia or ableism of Life is Strange, which this presentation will not touch upon, to the thematically deliberate, like the allegories all throughout Detroit Become Human. They cover both the highly fantastical, like the various forms of racist slavery across the Elder Scrolls series, and the barely fictionalized, like the racist violence in Life is Strange 2. A common trend throughout many of these depictions, however, is that they appear almost entirely concentrated within the narrative and aesthetic aspects of a game, and subsequently maintain a substantial distance to the player avatar. What does this mean in practice? Sometimes diegetic systems of oppression exist, but the player avatar bypasses them entirely. It might be something to be fought against, or it might simply be set dressing, but for any number of reasons, it never directly affects the player avatar. One example here might be Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The female avatar, Cassandra, can attend the Olympic Games and bear witness to the overt misogyny of anti-Greece in a quest circling around the prohibition of women attending the games at all. Cassandra's own presence and even participation of the games, however, is never addressed or questioned within the game world. In other cases, diegetic systems of oppression affect the player avatar, but only nominally so. The experience of oppression is relegated to cutscene or dialogue, moments where the player is not in control. The player's actions are not, or at most, barely affected by the diegetic systems. Hawk, the protagonist of Dragon Age 2 and player avatar, ostensibly begins the game as an impoverished refugee, but while this is occasionally alluded to, this poverty is entirely told, not felt. The year of indentured servitude it takes Hawk to earn their family's way into the city of Kirkwall is resolved with a fade to black. Within the gameplay, money is exclusively used to improve combat efficiency. The player never lacks for facilities or a home base. Their ability to play the game is not meaningfully affected, unless they choose to pretend as much. Such an effect, however, is entirely dependent on player volition to identify with and feel empathy for their avatar. This presentation, however, means to suggest another way and intends to discuss how systemic oppression might be depicted within the formal elements, that is, the systems and rules of gameplay. Enter NeoCab. In Chance Agency's 2019 indie visual novel, the player takes charge of Lena. She's a gig worker driving for an Uber-esque taxi app, and subsequently, she is economically subaltern. In her 2019 book, Hustle and Gig, Struggling and Surviving in the Sharing Economy, Alexandria J. Ravenel outlines a few major factors that constitute the systemic pressures on modern-day gig workers. There's sub-living standard wages that are further undercut by a significant number of hidden costs that workers incur simply to be able to fulfill their jobs, having to supply and maintain their own work materials, such as vehicles, fuel, etc. There is an enormous uncertainty as gig workers forgo many traditional forms of worker protections and securities in favor of an economic model that has them rely on any number of factors outside of their control, such as the policies of varying apps, fluctuating customer demands and trends, ever-changing algorithms that promote or or cover certain services, etc. And subsequently, a severe strain on the workers' mental and emotional well-being, born both from this uncertainty and from the ever-increasing demands of long hustling hours that quickly transcend traditional 9-to-5 work. Now in NeoCab, gameplay is mainly spent picking out passengers in the eponymous NeoCab app and chatting with them during the trip. At first glance, these formal elements in NeoCab exist in somewhat of a contrast to the narrative. Right off the bat, during the first night of the game's runtime, Lena's good friend Savvy, the entire reason that Lena has moved to town at all, goes missing, ostensibly kidnapped, certainly in danger. Lena, however, is not at liberty to pursue those leads right away. Instead, she must work to sustain herself. The gameplay in NeoCab, then, almost a distraction standing in the way of the main plot, rests on three major pillars that each inform one another: money, user ratings, and Lena's mood. The player has to balance these while only being afforded a certain amount of time and subsequently a certain amount of trips during each in-game night, which must be allocated accordingly to managing these factors. Money is quintessential to be able to continue playing the game at all. Each distance driven, whether to ferry passengers or to progress the game's story, consumes fuel, which must be paid for, lest the player wishes to pay for an expensive towing fee on top and be unable to take on customers for lack of fuel for the trip. The player must maintain at least enough income to keep their vehicle running through the story events, or they are unable to progress. Additionally, Lena is effectively homeless, and at the end of each night needs to pay for shelter. Most of the options of shelter are somewhat remote, incurring more fuel costs to reach them, and fairly cheap, leaving Lena racked with nightmares that adversely affect her mood. The only accommodation that won't cause such umbrage is so expensive that, together with fuel costs, Lena will be bleeding money even when reaching her already fairly ambitious daily shift goals. The only true bit of luxury that Lena could hope to achieve, the upscale Babylon Hotel, cannot be earned through labor. The only ways to spend the night here, even a single night over the game's runtime, is to either engage in a crime of opportunity or be lucky enough to benefit from an NPC's charity. And there is no way to escape this transient homelessness at all. User ratings represent a permanent sword of Damocles. Right off the bat, the player is informed that if ever a driver falls below a 4 out of 5-star rating for any length of time, they are kicked off the app, subsequently severing Lena's sole income stream, leading to a swift game over. Each passenger posts their evaluation as soon as they've reached their destination. What that rating will be then depends on how satisfied the passenger is with the conversation on the drive. In part, each of these conversations requires the player to ascertain what each respective passenger wants to hear. This task is complicated by Lena's mood. Many of the passengers are inconsiderate, rude, or outright abusive, like these two recurring passengers who are stubbornly convinced that Lena is a robot sitting in a self-driving car and treat her accordingly, which understandably sours Lena's emotional state. This emotional state, represented by a feel grid in the menu and helpful neon mood lighting in play, must be maintained to some extent by pushing back and standing her ground against the more abusive passengers, etc. For the worse Lena's mental state gets, the less she is able to keep up politeness. As her mood goes sour, increasingly more and more dialogue options become locked out or get replaced with angry or combative dialogue choices, which makes favorable passenger interactions harder and harder to achieve thus adversely affecting user ratings, thus directly threatening Lena's livelihood. Without ever touching upon the diegetic game world or the game's main story, Lena is unmistakably trapped in a cycle, never earning enough to escape a nightly rut of bearing abuse with a smile and carefully planning routes and finances to eke out shreds of free time to pursue her missing friend and subsequently the game's narrative. But more importantly, the player is trapped in that very same rut. In most video games, the concerns of player and avatar diverge considerably. A player guiding Private Ramirez on his way to retake Burgertown, Washington, D.C. from Russian paratroopers probably isn't terribly concerned about the fate of the free world. In NeoCab, on the other hand, Lena's concerns and those of the player are aligned much more closely. They worry about the same things. They feel the same setbacks. The frustration and anger when a friendly but seemingly technologically illiterate former convict leaves a 1-star rating, mercilessly lowering the average down toward the dreaded threshold, is shared between player and avatar. The anxiety, wondering if the remaining fuel will be enough to finish a fare and limp to the charging station, is felt by the player as much as it is by Lena. In other words, one might suggest that within the safety of this digital simulation, the player is not just seeing or hearing about the economic oppression faced by low-income gig workers. They are experiencing it. And none of this asks any particularly heightened buy-in from the player. They need not be particularly immersed in the diegetic game world or story of NeoCab, nor do they need to feel any heightened empathy for Lena or identify with her to any meaningful extent. In her 2011 essay, I Am in Love with Someone That Doesn't Exist, Annika Verne used the term bleed to describe the transfer of emotions from avatar to player contingent on a number of factors, immersion, emotional attachment, and the like. But while such bleed may occur here, by aligning the concerns and worries of avatar and player, to an extent, the game can forego the avatar entirely and induce what this presentation will refer to as imposed bleed, the transfer of emotion and affect directly from gameplay to player. Therein, one might find a narratological potential that goes beyond simple ludonarrative harmony. Indeed, in the case study at hand, with deliberate friction between the narrative draw to look for savvy and the demands of the gameplay to keep working, the question of ludonarrative harmony might even be debated. Instead, concurrently to conventionally told stories, big and small, the game's overarching narrative and the little side stories related to each passenger, the gameplay tells a story all of its own. The aforementioned alignment of concerns occurs almost entirely within the formal gameplay elements, with gameplay systems and cycles poised to simulate the oppression of the that the avatar is subject to, not ancillary, not as a backdrop or theme, but front and center. The chains of, in this case, economic oppression are imposed on the choices and actions that a player undertakes during play. The systemic oppression flows into and forms and shapes the systems of gameplay. This player subsequently needs to buy in no further than simply wanting to play the game at all. They just need to want to progress or to avoid fail states to be subject to this imposed bleed. The player's exact emotional responses to this tacit simulation of the stresses of economic oppression are their own. The stresses themselves, however, and how they are presented is carefully curated and consistent with Alexandria Ravenel's parameters for how comparable experiences manifest in the world outside the game. Additionally, this method makes it far easier for the player to recognize the injustices encountered in the game as systemic. Lena's poverty is not up to individual choices, and certainly not hers, as the choices in the game are made by the player anyway. Escaping the vicious cycle of scraping by from gig to gig is not a matter of making the right choices, of completing enough missions, or leveling up enough. Even the most careful or skilled player can never thrive in the world of NeoCab. No amount of perfect 5-star ratings or maximized route efficiency is going to buy leaner multiple nights and acceptable accommodation, never mind a way out of poverty. The rules won't allow it. That is, both the systemic economic injustice of the diegetic world mirroring our own, and the game rules that enshrine this oppression, both on display for the player to see and chafe against. There is no bootstrap to pull on. The game is literally and obviously rigged from the start. Now, NeoCab is a small game, and its systems and especially graphic presentation, as elegantly as they intertwine, are in many ways rudimentary. Still, I would like to posit that the patterns that we can observe here of how, through aligning the concerns of player and avatar, feelings of oppression and considerations of oppression can be mediated. And with this proof of concept in hand, it seems exciting to speculate, to imagine the experiences that may become possible to mediate with sufficiently careful narrative game design, with sufficiently resolute applications of the principles that are merely hinted at here. Gayatri Spivak once posed the loaded question: can the subaltern speak? In a field as consolidated and rife with controversy as today's games industry, many of the points she raised remain pressing and valid. But beyond the concerns over circumstances and control of production, her essay might also be read as a lamentation of the limitations of the media of the time. So, in video games, can the subaltern speak? Will it be allowed to? That remains to be seen. But the subaltern can feel, and with careful enough design, we might be able to feel with it. And I, for one, would like to think that with narrative games imposing such experiences, perhaps we might be able, if not to listen, then to sympathize. Thank you for your time.